to begin my talk, let me say that that the purpose of this subject, the reason that we're going to examine it in 2 sessions, is that it's central to the mission of our nonprofit organization, the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and certainly my personal mission in life, at least one of the most important ones, which is participating in and helping to have a meaningful contribution to the next significant worldview to emerge along the timeline of human history, right? The logic is simple. There's many different ways to think about this next worldview, but as I'll, again, cover in the lecture a little bit, we can see now one of the tenets of the thinking that organizes this group is that we can see these major worldviews, that these are the major structures of noosphere evolution or cultural evolution. And these worldview structures are known as traditionalism, modernism, and progressive postmodernism, and that we can see how they've arisen in history. And the simple logic is that something comes next. You know, modernity is not the end of history. Postmodernity is not the end of history. Something's coming next. And so determining what that is, what it looks like, what its contours are, how we can participate in its emergence, what the good things that it can do, the problems it can solve, right? All these things are part of the general theme of this Zoom group. But among the elements that are necessary for this new worldview to emerge and gain traction in history, there's lots of conflicts that need to be resolved or agreements that need to be worked out so that this culture can gain the minimum intersubjective systemic existence that it needs to become part of the noosphere. I mean, it already has in some ways, but I don't think it's fair to point to this worldview as pre-existent, or that I can talk about it as this worldview is like this, or the agreement around this postmodern or integral perspective is this, because it's still emerging now, right? It isn't pre-formed. It's something that we're creating together, hence the need for group discussion and group deliberation regarding what the social norm of spiritual pluralism, if we're going to have one, what that looks like within this cultural space. Part of the problem is that, as I'll explain, there's many lines of spiritual development, not just different forms of spirituality, different spiritual paths, but large-scale cultural streams, which I'll elaborate. And each one of these streams of spirituality, spiritual culture, the growing tip of those is beginning to appear within this nascent post-postmodern cultural milieu. And so recognizing this and recognizing that there's no agreement yet, that there's a lot of strong rivalries between the different spiritual paths, many times those rivalries are covert, but they end up creating a degree of discord that is one of the things that's keeping this larger worldview from forming and becoming, as I said, more having greater systemic integrity and greater, existence in history. So, getting to an agreement is what this overview is about, and I want to talk about these various frames for thinking about spirituality because it gives us a way to go beyond what passes for spiritual pluralism in our culture right now. So obviously, within the traditional worldview, most religions are fairly exclusive. In other words, they're the one true way. There's some notable examples in history of traditional level cultures being inclusivist, but even when they were including and having a degree of pluralism, there was always one dominant religion that was thought to be, the most true. The others were just sort of tolerated and allowed. Then we get to modernity, and that's a big breakthrough for at least formal legal spiritual pluralism, right? It's enshrined in the Bill of Rights, right? The freedom of religion is an important kind of spiritual pluralism because the state is no longer in the business of telling you what to believe. So that's an important step. But then we have progressive postmodernism as a historically significant form of culture. And it gives rise to its own kind of spirituality, which of course takes up previous forms. But in the context of the spiritual revival, right, that has been occurring over the last 60 years, partially as a result of the gradual emergence of progressive postmodernism that's been going on for, close to 150 years, we have this, we have the spiritualities that move into this third category really do have their own cultural character. And within that character, at least beginning in the 60s, there was this opening, welcoming, what some might call New Age, right? The term New Age has become a term of derision, so I'm not really going to use it because it doesn't accurately describe this larger category of progressive spirituality. But there was a kind of an agreement to let 1,000 flowers bloom, so to speak. There was a relativism, that is the larger cultural relativism of progressive postmodernism, at least for a time, was translated within the a milieu of alternative spirituality that arose and gained traction primarily within that cultural frame. And while that level of welcoming relativistic pluralism is arguably significantly diminished from its height, say in the 90s, there's still a certain degree of relativistic pluralism, right? So moving beyond, attempting to transcend and include the spiritual orientations of all the major worldviews is part of the job of this postmodern worldview, because as I've explained in other lectures, it emerges as a kind of a synthesis, right? That as modernity and traditionalism after World War II in America, most of my remarks have to do with America, but of course it applies to many other developed countries as well. But after World War II, as traditionalism and modernism, which were historically kind of dialectically separated, as those formed a kind of a solid cultural truce between them, that is the patriotism and economic growth, it was all kind of one established culture known by the counterculture as the establishment. And so the consolidation of the establishment created a strong thesis which allowed for the antithesis, right, in dialectical terms, the emergence of the antithesis, which is the stance of progressive postmodern. The thing that ties all the various threads of progressive postmodernism together is that it's in this antithesis to the establishment, right, to modernity and traditionalism as well. Now, I'm speaking in broad generalizations, and what I'm about to say can certainly find many exceptions, and these are not rigid categories. These are orienting generalizations, and they're helpful because it allows us to see the cultural forces, the dialectical challenges that are vying within this nascent post-postmodern space. And we, in our attempt to transcend progressive postmodernism, we want to transcend relativism, while at the same time carrying it forward. So how to do that is the focus of what I'm going to be talking about. In this group, we've established a degree, I think, of political pluralism, right? We saw that over the last couple of Zoom meetings. The philosophical basis for our political pluralism is fairly worked out. Something I've talked about in other contexts. That philosophical basis is that there's a prime political polarity that's indestructible, that continuously reappears, and that these prime elements, right, as I characterize them as fix what's wrong and preserve what's right, or we can think about them in terms of progressive and conservative. But however we look at it, that polarity continues to reappear in almost every human polity. And we know from polarity theory that those two major kinds of politics are ultimately interdependent, that the value-creating capacity of each is partially determined by the moderating influence of the other, right? So the political pluralism is pretty straightforward, but spiritual pluralism is much more complex, because there's not just a left and a right. There's many different levels and cross-level dialectical differences, which don't always result in conflicts or contests, but they're there nonetheless, and it's good, I think, to bring them to light, because it allows us to create a culture of challenge and support, a cultural agreement space in which different spiritual truth claims can be improved, evolved through their challenge by alternative truth claims, And I'm not suggesting that these things can be completely worked out, or that we can have some kind of empirical analysis regarding spiritual truth claims. But nevertheless, being aware of the tensions, I think, is the first step in achieving a kind of spiritual pluralism that is growthful, that can help all the lines of spirituality which exist within this nascent culture to grow and prosper and create what they do with greater effect in terms of their what they deliver. So I'll talk about that in a second. So in this talk, I'm going to give a short definition of religion and spirituality. In some ways, they're synonymous. In other ways, we might delineate religion as separate, but in general, I'll talk about this category and I'll define what I mean. Then I want to talk about these major lines of spiritual development, which I mentioned. And then finally, I want to talk about the challenge and support. What are the challenges? What are the agreements of support that we might find as we attempt to create a new level of spiritual culture? So, this is a short definition. There's many different definitions of religion and spirituality, of course, much more academic than this. But just to have a stake in the ground, I'll define religion and spirituality, again, generally speaking, as the feelings, thoughts, intentions, practices, and community affiliations that surround the attempt to make contact with ultimate reality, right? So maybe that definition is too exclusive, I don't know, but we could talk about that in the comments if you like. But another way to think about spirituality is through this idea of the hermeneutic circle, right? A hermeneutic circle is a circle of understanding where the elements of the circle inform each other and describe each other, right? So here we have spiritual practice, spiritual experience, and spiritual teachings. Now, some may say, well, I just do yoga. I'm just interested in spiritual practice. I'm not interested in these other elements. But spiritual practice is in a sense, at least historically, it's been defined by spiritual teachings, right? The spiritual teachings give not only the form of the practice, but the reason for the practice and the goal of the practice. And the practice, if done well, leads to spiritual experience, some kind of spiritual experience. And there's many different kinds of spiritual experience. And again, I'll talk more about that. But as people experience spirit, that experience informs the teachings. Indeed, many, perhaps most forms of contemporary spiritual paths, most spiritualities, their spiritual teaching is about both the practice and the experience. So I'm showing this circle to try to draw a wide net around what constitutes spirituality. Because as I'm going to explain when I get to secular spirituality, spiritual experience, spiritual teaching, and spiritual practice is still there, although in a certain truncated form. Okay, so this is just a quick review. I've showed this slide many times. I mentioned it at the beginning. One of the foundations of our understanding in this group is the evolution of consciousness and culture. And as culture evolves, it's not just a seamless continuum. The process of development is dialectical, as I mentioned. And this dialectical development creates steps and stages, right? Stages are a natural behavior of systems at every level. And so the system of cultural evolution, our larger cultural ecosystem, is no exception. Certainly, as many of you know, there's pre-traditional stages. This stage that we're trying to get to is post-postmodern, I'm calling it, and I'll explain why I'm using that awkward term. But this is just to ground just to remember that this is sort of the foundation of our understanding. And these three worldviews, they give origin to three major streams of spirituality. And every spiritual path is its own line with its own evolution. But when we look at a cultural analysis, we begin to recognize that these lines group together. So, of course, we've got religious spirituality as number one, which is straightforward. It includes the established religions that are grounded in the traditional worldview. Right? I mean, we can see some exceptions, but what people think of when they think of religion in America, they're thinking of Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Buddhism. And these lines, the reason I'm describing them as lines is that they originate in these different worldviews, but they grow up through the worldviews. So, for example, traditional Christianity, we certainly have the cultural expressions of it, which are straightforwardly traditional in their cultural orientation. But we also have modernist Christians and postmodern Christians and some post-postmodern Christians. And while we could argue that as this line evolves through the stages, it becomes a different kind. Does religious spirituality become secular as it moves into modernity? Does it become progressive as it moves into postmodernism? Certainly. I mean, there's overlap, right? Richard Rohr, is he a traditional religious teacher or a progressive spiritual teacher? I would say in some ways both. But in general, for the most part, there's still a strong line of religion in America. It still is the largest of these kinds. And so for just a quick definition, and that's what I'm talking about, is these lines of the traditional religion, not only in their traditional home, but as they grow throughout the culture. Now, secular spirituality is a more controversial term, right? Just in terms of the definition, it includes atheism, religious naturalism, existentialism, secular humanism, Marxism, emergentism, and scientism. And, Bill Mayer once quipped, atheism is a religion like abstinence is a sex position. And so certainly those who are hostile to religion of any kind would deny that their way of looking at things is a form of spirituality. But again, as I argue at length in The Presence of the Infinite, the book, the secular spirituality serves as a direct substitute for the way religion has functioned in other times and in other places. It creates a frame of reality, most often physicalism or some kind of version of those. It explains the meaning of life or the meaninglessness of life. It's a metaphysical reality frame, and there's no way that we may know these things in our hearts. We may have a conviction. We may have experience. But there's none of the people who ascribe to secular spirituality can say with any certainty that the universe is purely physical, right? That many of the tenets of secular spirituality are held as matters of faith, right? And they're held, in defense of what they see as perhaps the overreach of faith, religious faith. So again, I could talk about these lines for quite a bit. I'm just skimming over the top because the purpose of this talk is about spiritual pluralism. Let me go on to the third one, and that is what I'm calling progressive spirituality, right? I'm not using the term New Age because that's too narrow. Progressive spirituality, as I'm defining it, again, it reaches backward and forward in history. It reaches certainly back in history by including pre-traditional forms and honoring, ancient traditions. But in many ways, those traditions, whether they're shamanic or they're, Eastern or they're transformed by the postmodern context of their cultural expression, right? So just to read the definition, it includes westernized postmodern versions of traditional Eastern religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Taoism. It also includes psychedelic culture, ancient indigenous and shamanic religions, channeling, paganism, astrology, as well as newer forms like transpersonal psychology and feminist spirituality and eco-spirituality. Right? So these are all disparate forms. There's certainly dialectical tensions between these forms, ways that they might deny each other. But at one point, at least in the 90s and the early aughts, again, the culture of progressive alternative spirituality was open to practically all of these. And a lot of the practitioners of progressive spirituality were not path exclusive. They kind of approached spirituality as a personal matter. And in many ways, spirituality is, of course, a very personal matter. It's tempting to even say, well, look, we don't have to worry about all these different teachings. We're just going to say that we create pluralism by allowing each person's relationship to the ultimate reality of the divine to be theirs, and each person is different. And that sounds like an attractive option. But part of the reason that we have to deal with these cultural expressions is that, as I showed the hermeneutic circle, the teachings create culture. I mean, the practice does and the experience does, but the teachings more than anything, they inevitably make propositions, no matter how non-conceptual they may aspire to be. They're making truth claims, and that creates culture, and those truth claims are powerful and important. They don't need to be discounted or relativized into being, all the same. I think that taking the spiritual truth claims of all the different lines of development that are now emerging within this postmodern cultural frame is part of the way that we can establish not only spiritual pluralism, but an authentic, open kind of postmodern spirituality, right? So there have been attempts to try to define what the spirituality of this postmodern or integral stage looks like. Perhaps the first one was The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo. But of course, we have Ken Wilber's integral spirituality. We have Andrew Cohen's evolutionary enlightenment. We have Paul Smith's integral Christianity. I mean, there's many, many books and teachings that attempt to suggest what a integral spirituality is. But I really don't think that it's possible to frame or define a singular kind of spirituality that represents this entire culture, because again, it's not just an ideology; it's an inclusive worldview. So I want to talk about these three barriers. Welcoming spiritual pluralism is good, until basically somebody wants to rank you in their hierarchy or say that the spiritual teachings that you believe are delusions, right? So these challenges are actually, rather than being threatening, they can be fun. They can be stimulating because ideally we can create a space of support wherein these spiritual truth claims can be challenged like never before. And I think that's one of the markers of this cultural characteristic of postmodern spirituality. So one of the barriers to spiritual pluralism is, of course, fundamentalism. And we think of fundamentalism as being a characteristic primarily of evangelicalism, of evangelical Christianity. And there's certainly Islamic fundamentalism. Almost every religion, every spiritual path has its fundamentalists. But it's also important to see how fundamentalism is not a characteristic solely of traditional spirituality. Every form, traditional spirituality, secular spirituality, and progressive spirituality includes fundamentalists within their midst. And that includes either theological certainty or metaphysical certainty. If you know that your view of what's spiritually true is absolutely the only possible view and everybody else is wrong, then clearly that's going to be a barrier to some kind of spiritual pluralism. The other one is reductionism, right? Again, reductionism can be found in every one of these lines, but it's primarily a characteristic of secular spirituality, which the culture of which is very much about debunking, right? And much of it has arisen as I said, as a defense, and it attempts to debunk both religious spirituality, which is its main target, but also progressive spirituality, which it just sort of dismisses or lumps in with religious spirituality. I can say that I'm not a member of any specific religion, but I am a believer. I'm a panentheist, and my core belief is that every human is indwelt by a fragment of infinity, or what Jung called a splinter of divinity. So this indwelling spirit, I think, is a huge part of what makes me a believer. But again, I'm not out here to promote my particular spiritual belief, which is rather personal and eclectic. It's more about pushing off against reductionism. We can't have spiritual pluralism if a person who is in the culture or participating in the culture basically believes that the world is purely physical and that spirit isn't real, that spiritual practice and spiritual experience, that those are not making contact with some kind of reality. And obviously I reject that. I don't think that we could say that any spiritual experience can be used to sort of claim some empirical truth. But there are some very interesting aspects of spirituality that recur in all kinds of different spiritual paths. And those are worth looking at and considering. The way to think about that is perennialism, right? So I'm listing perennialism as a barrier to spiritual pluralism because of its tendency of what you might call belief system imperialism. Right? For those who are not familiar with perennialism, it began as an attempt to get at the core truth that all religions are grounded on. And this core truth was primarily evinced by the experiences of mystics who were said to, mystics in every different major world religion seem to be having the same kinds of mystical experiences. So it's very tempting to say they're all seeing the same thing, therefore we can rely on the reports of mystics to create a kind of universal spirituality that's based directly on experience. So the promise of perennialism was attractive, and I could certainly understand that. But in practice, it led to, again, this sort of assertion that there was a particular kind of core of reality, that ultimate reality could be discerned in mystical experience, and that was simply empirical. It's been sort of called broad empiricism. However, part of the problem is, let me just read this quote from Jorge Ferrer, who's a well-respected advocate of progressive spirituality in general, and I think spiritual pluralism in particular. The esotericist claim that mystics of all ages and places converge about metaphysical matters is a dogma that cannot be sustained by the evidence. Even though perennialists, to their credit, reject both the exclusivism of exoteric believers and the inclusivism of sentimental ecumenism, their commitment to a non-dual monistic metaphysic that is supposed to be absolute, universal, and paradigmatic for all traditions is ultimately a return to dogmatic exclusivism and intolerance. So again, I'm skimming over the top. Why perennialism ultimately fails is that it's caught up in the larger sort of goals of progressive spirituality. And if you look at it in history, an important task for both modernism and postmodernism was to transcend the political and cultural hegemony of religion. Especially, in the West, it was Protestant Christianity, and in America. And so modernity in the Enlightenment, very important to push off against the pathologies, the stifling pathologies of religion. So a huge telos of modernity is to create a secular government, right, to separate church and state. And that has led to good. But the task of transcending traditional religion is also a task that has to be taken up by postmodernism. Because postmodernism, in trying to transcend modernity, also wanted to transcend secularism. It wanted to re-enchant the world. Hence, the vibrant interest in spirituality that was rekindled in the 60s, democratized, the birth of the New Age and alternative spirituality, was an attempt to find spirituality in places that would be fresh and new and that wouldn't cause a cultural regression to a traditional frame. Traditional religions were not attractive to early progressive postmodernists, at least the Western ones, partially because they were trying to transcend that, right? That they saw that as, at least even unconsciously, as if they were to embrace Christianity, for example, then that would make them traditional culturally. And that wasn't always the case. Plenty of progressive postmodern spiritual practitioners found a progressive version of Christianity. So again, these lines of development, you can only put so much weight on them analytically. But nevertheless, this task of transcending traditionalism has been an important focus of both modernity and postmodernity. But now that we're moving into the third step beyond traditional religion, we can look back in that and say, look, if we're trying to create a synthesis, then 3,000 years of religion, we're not going to just brush that aside and replace it with some kind of eclectic New Age syncretism that ultimately, that if we try to deny our religious heritage, it's going to become a sort of shadow in our culture, that until we've integrated that shadow, we're going to have all kinds of problems. So an important part of post-progressive spirituality, postmodern spirituality, if as it's being formed, as it's just beginning to emerge now, is to say, look, we can safely reclaim many of the very important gifts of traditional religions without the danger of regressing back to a traditional set of social norms or mores. So that, again, I'm not making the arguments that would be required to convince a skeptic of the assertions that I'm making. Again, those are made in my book. But I'm giving you these frames, so at least a way to talk about spiritual pluralism. Okay, so here's my proposal, if you will. And some of these are easy and some of these are not. So let me just kind of go over 6 potential elements for the agreement that's on offer, the agreement that I hope we can, at least explore and maybe have some tentative agreement about. First, I think it involves welcoming and honoring the best of all of these lines. One of the things I didn't say, but I do say in The Presence of the Infant, is that each one of these lines have beautiful expressions and pathologies, right? That there's religious spirituality has got, of course, the most, pathologies because it's been around for 3,000 years or more. And, the crimes of history, all the problems with the church and the corruption. So you can certainly say, well, if we're talking about pathologies, traditional religion has the most egregious pathologies. And secular and progressive are pretty minor by comparison. However, certainly secular spirituality, I would argue, I'm not going to dwell on the negatives, but reductionism, chauvinism, intense hostility for all kinds of spirituality, those are, I would characterize as pathologies. At the New Age level, at the form of progressive spirituality, there's all kinds of pathological expressions of that. Magical thinking. Personally, I think The Secret and the whole idea of that is pretty pathological. There are many charlatans and hucksters and cults. So I could, again, spend a lot of time delineating what I see as the negatives of progressive spirituality. But I think that it has many beautiful expressions. And it's important to understand that at least the integral culture, that one of the main trunks of integral culture, postmodern culture, comes out of progressive spirituality, right? In other words, westernized progressive Buddhism and Hinduism created a milieu of intellectual spirituality in which much of integral culture was born, right? And we could even trace it back. Aurobindo, right? Even though he's not really a traditional Hindu, he's one of the early proponents of what I'm calling progressive spirituality. Teilhard de Chardin, right? Many spiritual teachers from many different traditions who are nevertheless kind of part of this larger historical movement over the last, really beginning in the 1870s with Madame Blavatsky, right? We had last year we had Matt Siegel talk about Steiner and the whole theosophical tradition, which is one of the early expressions of progressive spirituality. But we've got to recognize that this integral culture owes a lot to its roots in progressive spirituality. That's how I came to it. That's how I know many people who are dedicated integralists sort of began in the milieu of progressive spirituality, that they were sort of dissatisfied with the sort of the lack of it was more about goodness and beauty, where truth was kind of bracketed. And they were interested in reclaiming a more intellectually rigorous understanding of spiritual truth. This is one of the main foundations of this integral perspective, although it's certainly more than a form of spirituality, right? It's a cultural milieu. It's got politics. It's got all these different elements. So again, to acknowledge and resist the respective pathologies of each line, right? In other words, if we are beginning to recognize that these streams have negatives, that in the same way that we approach the integration of the major worldview structures by teasing apart the dignities from the disasters, right? By carrying forward the best and pruning away the worst. That same practice really, I think, has to take place as we try to recognize what's an authentically integral level expression of secular spirituality and progressive spirituality and religious spirituality. And so acknowledging the duty to resist the negatives and not just be relativistic, I think it's a very important part of this proposed social norm that I'm suggesting. Okay, number 3, practice epistemic humility. Even though we may know what's true in our heart. We may have had a direct experience of spirit that informs our spiritual beliefs and those are unshakable. But nevertheless, we live in a vast mystery, right? So like no one can claim that they know for certain, we have faith that we're going to survive our bodies and have life after death. But certainly no human we know in this realm has experienced life after death. So we all have to have a degree of epistemic humility, even as we hold fast to our particular faith in the spiritual teachings that guide our path. Related to that is number 4, know the difference between your personal belief system and agreed to or established facts, right? This is an important element, I think, of the norm, in the sense that owning your belief system, knowing what is your belief system versus something you're just asserting as just the way it is, that's kind of a form of certainty that we could say is ultimately a form of fundamentalism, right? So I think a degree of belief system ownership and epistemic humility are virtues that do well in this social norm. Number 5 is a little bit more challenging. And the philosophy that is the foundation of this emerging worldview, the post-postmodern worldview or integral worldview, it's based on a foundational understanding of the interior universe. And what I mean by that is that if we're going to say that consciousness and culture evolve, and we're going to say that consciousness is an interior phenomenon, it's subjective, and the intersubjective elements of culture is also part of this interior, then giving those interiors a sort of an ontological status, right? That there's real stuff going on inside those interiors. They're not just imaginary, as Yuval Harari, who's one of the major teachers of secular spirituality, would maintain. I'm saying no, that our thoughts are real, that there's an ontology of our mind, and then there's an ontology of our culture. These cultural systems and all their subsystems, those have a real existence in the interior. And so just the basic idea, the basic proposition that the reality has interiors where evolution takes place, that's a pretty foundational and important element of integral philosophy. And if your spiritual path, of the spiritual teachings that you ascribe to, deny the possibility of interiority through reductionism, right? If everything's just physical and everything's just objective and everything else is imaginary, then I would say that that's a pathology that needs to be pruned away, that your spiritual teachings have to be roomy enough to recognize some kind of interiority. Now, I'd love to argue about this if people disagree or think that's pushing it too far. But another one relative to that is value realism. The good, the true, and the beautiful, right? They're not entirely subjective. They're not just projections, that they have an ontological status. Now, they're not things. They're not objective. Again, I spent a lot of time arguing about what values are and how we can think about their ontology in my forthcoming book, but I've also addressed the reality of values in all of my other books as well. And I would argue that some recognition of the reality of values is a necessary element because without that, it's hard to maintain the truths of integral philosophy. And then finally, perhaps the toughest one in this number 5, is the idea that the universe is a purposive phenomenon, right? And the idea that the universe has a purpose, I don't know. That some folks may say, well, I buy into integral thinking, but I don't agree with that. My argument would be that first, that purpose is in the universe, right? We all have it, right? It's what defines life from non-life. So I think that we can look at the purpose that's clearly in the universe and say that this is a powerful evidence for a purpose of the universe. And of course, there's many different ways we could characterize what that purpose is or how we might find it. So I'm not saying that we all have to agree about the purpose of the universe, but the idea that the universe is a purposeless accident, that's a kind of magical thinking, right? It's wishful thinking because I just think it violates reason and experience to claim that the reality that we enjoy and the personal existence that we each have is just a complete accident, or it happened automatically, or that there's nothing behind it. It's just kind of random, that it happened by chance to kind of come together. And again, those are some of the pathologies of secular spirituality, right? That they claim that the universe is meaningless, or that it is absurd, even. And so I would challenge that. I would say, no, that I think there's plenty of evidence that the universe is not an accident and that it is purposive. And this is, again, one of the main focuses of my forthcoming book. So chew on that and see whether you can agree with that in terms of this norm of spiritual pluralism. And we can debate that and see what that looks like. We could maybe add other elements that are part of integral philosophy, foundations to integral philosophy, like human free will, which is an organ of perception for value, right? Sam Harris says there's no such thing as free will. He says there's no such thing as beauty, right? So value realism, the recognition of a modicum of human agency, I'd say these are all elements that are ultimately spiritual, that they inform spiritual teachings and spiritual teachings inform them. So I would say that if we're not going to get the world view without its philosophical foundations. Those foundations can support many different spiritual paths. But the idea that it's all just meaningless, I think, is one of the things that's not going to survive, even as the line of secular spirituality grows into this post-postmodern cultural milieu. And 5, working to bridge the dialectical differences. So what are these dialectical differences? In other words, we know from polarity theory that when you have an indestructible polarity, a positive polarity, right? If you have a positive-negative polarity, it's a problem to be solved. When you have a positive polarity, it's indestructible. It continues to reappear. It's recursive. And ultimately, the positives of each side are necessary for their respective value-creating capacities. And so one of the ways that that polarity theory describes the practice of working with these permanent systems is challenge and support, right? Like good parenting, right? You want to support your kids wholeheartedly, but you also want to challenge them too. And challenge and support is a polarity unto itself, right? That is in a sense a practice that supports all these other polarities. And there's a polarity wherever there's a dialectical difference, but not all dialectical differences are positive, right? They're mixed, right? Within these dialectical separations, there are, truths and untruths, but there's also truths and truths. So what am I talking about? So some of the primary permanent dialectical differences, at least, well, maybe permanent is overstating it. When I talk about these lines of development, it's a snapshot of the current culture in America, right? Whether 100 years from now, there'll still be secular spirituality, progressive spirituality, and religious spirituality. I'm not sure, right? I think there's going to be major religious revivals, but those revivals will be not at a traditional level of culture, right? So maybe it'll all merge back together into postmodern and, if you'll pardon the term, postmodern spirituality. Maybe there'll be a unifying trend, but I can't predict the future. So for now, the snapshot of these 3 lines is useful because they create dialectical differences, which in a sense are keeping this culture from forming, right? So first, we have the dialectical differences between science and philosophy and spirituality, and then perhaps the overarching dialectic between science and religion. But as I've argued elsewhere, I say that these are 3 indispensable, science, philosophy, and religion are 3 indispensable approaches to truth, and that we need all 3 of them, that science cannot do the job of either philosophy or spirituality, that spirituality shouldn't undertake the proclamation of scientific truths, especially when they are contradicted by scientific truths. So science has to challenge, very important challenges to both philosophy and spirituality. Spirituality has to challenge science to be moral, and philosophy has to bridge and separate the two. So that's one dialectic or set of dialectical differences that is part of the negotiation, the challenge and support that I would say needs to occur within the social norm that we're at least aspiring to imagine. 2, certainly between all 3 lines, secular spirituality especially, it has a hard time, doesn't play nice with religious spirituality or progressive spirituality. And there are those who are right on the line, trying to blur it, right, trying to take secular spirituality as far as it can go by using all of the lingo and the understandings of the great spiritual traditions, both progressive and religious, but doing so within a somewhat covert frame whose loyalties are to naturalism. right? Again, people are seeking truth, right? And at this time in history, what's true is not entirely obvious. So I'm not saying that the attempt to purge magical thinking, even when it goes too far, is all wrong. But again, you reach the back of your head if you look far enough out, and in the attempt to purge magical thinking, secular spirituality generates its own versions of magical thinking, which again are subject to challenge and support. And then finally, this idea that there's a dialectical difference between non-duality and theism, right? So let me explain what I mean by this. Again, this is a big focus of the presence of the infinite. Non-duality is a family of spiritual views, primarily rooted in Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, but present in all world religions. There's non-dual Islamism, non-dual Christianity, both ancient and modern. And it is it's based on kind of a universal spiritual experience. It's known in the kind of the social science literature as the unitive experience. It's also known as samadhi. There are many other descriptions of it. But it does seem to be that mystics throughout the ages, and not just mystics, but ordinary people too, report these experiences of where subject and object, in a sense, dissolves, and where people are they're feeling the complete oneness. It's either complete oneness or complete emptiness, right? In Buddhism, it's sunyata. And, they're not, Advaitin Hinduistic non-duality is not identical with Buddhist non-duality. But one of the things that we've seen with progressive spirituality over the last 60 years is that as it has emerged and evolved, it's become increasingly non-dual. So that within the culture of progressive spirituality, there's kind of a partial merger of Hinduism and Buddhism around the non-dual aspects. So if you look at traditional Buddhism, the most famous, the most popular kind is Pure Land Buddhism, which is a lot closer to theism than it is to non-duality, right? And the non-dual versions of these religions were usually the more esoteric. And again, I could talk a long time about what non-dual spirituality is. But many teachers who are within the milieu of progressive spirituality are examples of the non-dual teachers who are not teaching a specific lineage. They're not teaching Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta proper. They're teaching non-duality, which is kind of this larger hybrid. The most famous non-dual teacher is probably Eckhart Tolle. Many of you are familiar with him. But within especially post-postmodern culture, we have non-dual teachers like Rupert Spira or A.H. Almaas, right, or Adyashanti. These teachers are all teaching non-duality. They're not teaching Buddhism or Hinduism. They're not traditionalists. And so one of the things that we can, I think, see as from progressive spirituality as it's emerged over the last 60 years is that it's really brought non-duality into the West in a way that it never existed before and brought it into, I think that the rise of progressive spirituality may be compared in history at some point in the future a little bit like the Protestant Reformation, in the sense that it's adopted by millions of people and has a significant historical impact. So I want to honor non-dual spirituality and acknowledge that many of the folks who are in this culture would describe themselves as non-dualists, right? And so that's a very important line that is emerging, and that needs to be supported, and I would say to a degree challenged. The other line, I'm calling these attractor basins of spiritual experience, because the idea of an attractor basin is from systems theory. In other words, that as systems are moving around, they're pulled by what's sometimes called a strange attractor. Again, these are just analogies, but in other words, that there's a form of order that a chaotic system is sort of attracted to, and we can see that form of spiritual experience within the attractor basin of non-duality. It's not just for mystics. Meditation as a spiritual practice, at least the majority of its applications, has a kind of a non-dual orientation, right? Meditation for enlightenment is very much within this non-dual attractor basin of spiritual experience. But then we have the worldwide practice of prayer, right? Which is it has a more theistic orientation. By theistic, I mean believing in some kind of intelligent creator or some kind of God. And so I would say that like non-duality, that theism has its own attractor basin, right? In other words, that is, people who pray, people who worship, people who live their lives within a theistic spiritual tradition, like one of the Abrahamic faiths, often have deep spiritual experiences of the love of God, right? It's just like samadhi is the pinnacle of non-dual experience. This idea of a loving force in the universe, that is in a sense the heart of the attractor basin of this other side. And so, of course, the idea that non-duality is in a polarity with theism, that's anathema, I'm sure, to many non-dualists. So the whole point is to say that there's no separation, right? That it's all one. But the challenge is such that if love, almost every religion exemplifies love. Some call it compassion. But love is what religions are after, or, one of the prime values of religion. God is love is one of the watchwords of the Abrahamic traditions to a degree. And this idea of love, it's irreducibly relational. That is, love doesn't exist if there's no separation. You need a relationship to have love. So the challenge and that non-duality offers to theistic religions and theistic forms of spirituality of all kinds, and vice versa, is very important, right? So the idea of no self, right? If there's a loving intelligence that lives inside you and that loves and knows you, the idea that you don't have any self could be a problem, right? Or the idea that that the universe is an illusion, that the finite universe is completely, it's Maya or samsara, right? That's challenged by science, right? If the universe is an illusion, then empirical science is obviously it doesn't have a place to stand. And, so again, these are critiques that I'm making of non-duality that are philosophical critiques, they're theological critiques, and I make them with care and rigor in the book. I'm just skimming over them here, but I'm just giving you a teaser of this polarity and why I think it's going to be very important, especially as progressive post-postmodern culture emerges, because there's many people who are non-dualists, but there are many people who are theists or panentheists, as I am. Now, we could say that, of course, non-duality challenges theism in all kinds of ways. Perhaps the biggest challenge to theism is what's known as the problem of evil, right? How could there be a universe of suffering if the universe is created by love and if each creature is loved, right? So again, that's its own philosophical can of worms, and in the forthcoming book, I try to address that to some extent. And so each one, I argue, that is wise non-attachment, which is one of the practices of non-duality, and loving engagement, right, which is kind of an opposite practice, that goes with theism. Again, these are, we can find them on both sides. I'm not talking in absolutistic terms, but I'm saying that there's a polarity here, and it's a very yeasty one. That is, theism can be greatly improved by the challenges of non-duality, and vice versa. But if your spiritual teachings say that what's ultimately real is non-duality, and that theism is a delusion, or it's some lower level that you transcend on your way to my spiritual path, then that's obviously a challenge to spiritual pluralism. So again, I'm not suggesting relativism, but I'm not suggesting belief system imperialism either. I think we need to resist both of those. And that's the oscillation, as they say, between these alternative forms. So, some of these tensions are evident. I mean, just to be a little bit more specific, within this milieu of postmodern culture, we have metamodernism, which, as it's been forwarded by that author Hansi Freinack, very much an expression of secular spirituality, right? Although it's not a Richard Dawkins-style atheism, there's this embarrassment about, for example, Ken Wilber's spiritual teaching or my spiritual teaching. There's this sort of need to secularize, that if all this stuff, spiral dynamics, all of these philosophical understandings of the evolution of consciousness culture, they would be widespread if we could just get rid of this New Age bullshit that's attached to it, right? And so I understand that from a perspective of secular spirituality, progressive spirituality is highly embarrassing. But if your secular spirituality doesn't make a nod to the degree of minimal support necessary for pluralism, then it's not going to be able to be in this synthetic space. We can also see it within non-duality, right? I read many of these non-dual teachers, and they say that belief in God is a delusion, right? So I obviously take a degree of umbrage to that. And so these challenges are just abstract or theoretical, right? There's real cultural contests going on for the heart and soul of what this next cultural expression, this next great worldview will be. And recognizing these tensions, most of the time they're covert. There's just like one line ignores the others, right? There's this sort of exclusivism, like we don't want to even pay attention to them, even though they're saying things that are very similar to what we're saying. We're going to just ignore them because they're embarrassing, because they're New Age, or they're, or they're atheists or whatever. So these tensions they matter in the kind of cultural synthesis we're trying to create. And so I think the best thing to do now is to hear your questions and comments. Again, I could give many more examples. I could teach a course on this, but that's not what I'm up to right now. But this at least gives you some ideas to think about when we're asking the greater question of what is the social norm of spiritual pluralism that we can create both for this group as a seed kernel and for this larger emerging culture as a whole. Okay, so that's my talk. And thanks for, how long did I go? Okay, damn. I always go too long. But there's a lot out there, and we've got next month where you'll have a chance to think about this. And next month we're going to talk about it both in breakout groups and as a larger group. So sorry, there's only 15 minutes left. But Lisa, let's get the ball rolling with some questions and comments now.
Sure. Yeah. So if you have a question, just click the heart button, react button, and then click raise your hand. And just keep in mind, we're limited on time, so try to make your question, comment, reaction, challenge, and support concise. All right. So I'm going to start with David and then Tamar.
Steve, thank you. It was a great tour through the complex dilemma space of the big question here for what does this plural spirituality, postmodern pluralism look like? Two things I think you really hit the nail on the head of these core tensions are that spirituality is a personal matter and how that can devolve into solipsism versus the necessary shared beliefs of culture. And that cultural attractiveness is where my question really lands. And how do we formulate, or what are your first thoughts on formulating a culturally attractive framework that inherently requires a transcendence and exclusion of the sort of like chosen one vibe that most religions have as baked into their framework? For example, I live in Alabama and there's a lot of Baptist churches near my house. There's one Unitarian far away and it's not very popular. So how do you see selling this more complex framework to people under 40 or that have a more, less complex mindset that can make it amenable or attractive to them?
Sure, that's an excellent question. I mean, the top line answer is I don't know. but I will say some things about it. I think that like the Enlightenment, which emerged out of philosophy, I think that this postmodern worldview, the foundation of it is philosophy. And the philosophy is essentially a spiritual philosophy, but I don't think it is, at least I would like that philosophy not to be specifically identified with one particular spiritual path. And I think that as I mentioned regarding the various books that have attempted to describe what integral spirituality is, I don't think it's possible, given the presence of these various lines within this emerging cultural space, to define a singular form of spirituality. But the fact that the integral philosophy is a spiritual philosophy that recognizes progress and purpose in the universe, that understands that the good, the true, and the beautiful are sacred, that human life is sacred, that there are many elements which are still philosophical, right? Spiritual philosophy more than spiritual teachings. At least I'd like to keep the dialectical difference between spirituality and philosophy somewhat separate. I showed that in one of the slides. But I think the fact that it's a philosophy of progress and a philosophy of growth and a philosophy that's optimistic, right? A philosophy of hope and courage. I think those are all spiritual elements. Those are all virtues that connect with spirituality that will hopefully be attractive, right? But I've gotten to there were times in my life where I really felt like we needed to promote this worldview, almost like market it, right? Really try to take it out to the world, and I've sort of pulled back from that a bit. I think that the best way to advance or make a meaningful contribution to the emergence of this next historical level is to get the philosophy right, which is why we're talking about spiritual pluralism, because it's an element of the philosophy. I don't think the philosophy is powerful enough. Right? The culture doesn't exist yet in any significant way because the foundation of it is still in the process of formation. But I think once this philosophy begins to gain traction, then the culture will appear, and these questions that we're dealing with now will be something that people are talking about in a lot greater degree. So we're kind of ahead of our time in thinking about the need for a social norm around spiritual pluralism that transcends and includes and allows for challenge and support. That's a new idea, right? So we're looking at this for the first time. Again, it's still philosophy, it's still intellectual. Will that be attractive to the masses? I can't worry about that, right? I just have to think about, I have to focus on getting the truth right, and hopefully everything else will fall into place as a result of that.
Let me leave you with a bit of good news. My children are in a charter school here, kindergarten, second grade, and their weekly pledge is, part of it is, I will learn the true, I will do the good, and I will love the beautiful, is what the whole school is chanting as part of their weekly pledge. So there's hope for us here. So I just want to share that bit of good news. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you.
All right, Tamar and then Jackson Wild. Oh, Tamar, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Okay, it's Tamar, not Tamar, please. Okay, now, Carl, my question is, if you're looking at one spiritual or whatever philosophy, or maybe there are different direction. And what I'm meaning, in each religion, the same people are in the culture, right? In all the three traditional. Whatever,
secular and progressive, yeah.
Whatever, are the same people who kind of ways within the different traditional religions and whatever. And I see a lot of development, or the same cultural war, if you wish, exists within each tradition, each religion. Like, I am Jewish, and I have more commonality with you than with the most Orthodox in my religion, because we all interpret our own religion in totally different way. And I think that the more the progressive branches of each religion are getting closer to each other and much further from their roots, from their fundamentalist roots, and there is a lot of interface connections and trying to learn from each other, and definitely tolerance. And maybe this is a kind of solution, because, people are fundamentalists, that they need to have one truth and only one truth, and they cannot accept, that there is more than one truth or other way to see the world than there. You'll not change them, trust me.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, so let me respond. All right. So clearly, within the traditional worldview, the life conditions are, competing kingdoms, right, for the most part. And so ethnocentrism is a natural part of that level of cultural development. It can have healthy expressions. And so within religion, that same ethnocentrism that has a us and them mentality, that's expressed within, the different branches that are vying, within this traditional space. Similarly, right, in the postmodern space, relativism, cultural relativism is the prevailing norm, and the expressions of religion and spirituality that occur within that cultural space are highly influenced by that relativism. One thing I didn't mention in my talk, which I had in my notes, was this idea of inclusivism as a specific kind of pluralism, right? So there's relativism that says all religions are equally valid, right? We're not going for that. But we don't really have a way to say, well, this is more valid than that, at least not yet. But we can work it out. That's what the challenge and support is about. But the idea of inclusivism is that you recognize other spiritual paths as being valid, but you still have loyalty to your own path. right? And so the Dalai Lama is an inclusivist, right? He thinks, Tibetan Buddhism is the highest, but others are still good, right? We could point to, Vivekananda or Ramakrishna, right? Inclusivists. Yeah. So inclusivism, I would say that I'm kind of inclusivist as well. I think panentheism is the most true, but that doesn't mean I could be wrong, and that pantheism or many of these other options might ultimately be really what is the case with ultimate reality, right? So anyway, it's true, but we can't worry about creating a kind of pluralism for the world. We only have our opportunity is to think about what pluralism is at the post-postmodern level. Right, this new level of culture creates a new kind of pluralism. I mentioned legalistic pluralism of modernity and relativistic pluralism of postmodernity, but I think that we need to focus on what we can influence, and that is what pluralism looks like at this next emergent level.
Great. All right, Jackson Wild, and then Nish. And guys, keep it concise because we're getting down to it.
Yeah, I've just been reading through Claire Graves, and one of the things that stuck out from me from that, and that I've been thinking about, is he said it's not so much what each stage thinks, but how each stage thinks and how each stage solves problems. And I was wondering what kind of application that could have in the spiritual development of the individual, that it's not so much what each developmental stage believes, but maybe how is a bad word, but, how they believe, if you kind of get what I'm saying.
Sure. Well, I think believing with epistemic humility, right? I mentioned those elements. Believing with this idea that we do live in a mystery, and no matter how certain we may be or committed we may be to our particular path, then allowing that other paths have a piece of the truth. That these, again, the cliche is that all these different paths are feeling different parts of the elephant, right? And one part of the elephant is non-dual, and the other part is theistic, and one is kind of scientistic, and the other is way more mystical. But I think that a degree of allowing for the fact that there's these different lines, and that we're not going to create so thinking pluralistically, thinking synthetically. Not just pluralistically in a relativist sense, but pluralistically in a synthetic sense that we're trying to synthesize and get these things to interact with each other where they improve each other, right? We're in the first time in history, right? Over the last few years, humanity has assembled the wisdom of the ages, right? They're now all available, not only online, but just ask AI anything, right? And the treasure trove of spiritual wisdom is at our fingertips like never before in history. So we're only really beginning to kind of confront and digest this treasure trove of spiritual experience, spiritual practice, and spiritual teachings. And so just recognizing that we're like Lewis and Clark, we're exploring new territory. We can point out things that have never been seen before. Like, look, let's give that a name. We'll call it Mount Jefferson. So I just want to say that how we think about it is we think about it from a developmental perspective.
All right, thanks, Nish. And then if we have time, Pamela. Go for it, Nish.
Right, thank you, Steve. Great talk. When I look at the more traditional approaches to spirituality and the more postmodern approaches, one of the differences that I personally see is that in the traditional approaches, they're kind of more focused on the differences between traditions, and then on that basis they say they can be exclusive and say, well, this is our tradition, it's different to the others, this is the true one. If you look at the more postmodern approaches, they can sometimes be more focused on what unites the different traditions, so that enables them to be more relativistic, to pursue the more perennialism, because they're looking at the core truths. Would a useful tool to bring into this discussion be the distinction in integral theory between deep structures and surface structures? So the deep structures would be, the universal features that we see, and the surface structures would be the differences that we see. And the surface structures are all expressions of the deeper structures, and we give equal importance to both. That way we're honoring the differences in the way traditionalists might be more amenable to. We're also honoring the commonalities that the postmodernists would be more amenable to. And if we want the surface structures to be able to communicate with one another, or even respect, or even synthesize, we're going to have to probably go through the deep structures to do that, not merely try to be eclectic at the level of the surface structures. So is that a possible useful tool that we could use?
Well, I mean, sure. As far as it goes, I would just say in some ways, everything we're talking about is a deep structure, right? So I mean, even spiritual teachings, you could say, well, the surface of these attractor basins of spiritual experience, and the what you can see, you can maybe see somebody meditating or see somebody praying, but ultimately the explanation for that is the teaching, right, or the ecclesiastical explanation. And we could say, okay, well, that's a surface. But, one of the elements, one of the things that the early perennialists tried to do, like Schuon, was to say, look, there's esoteric religion and there's exoteric religion, right? Exoteric religion is rituals and belonging and belief systems. And then there's this core, which is esoteric, and it's deep, and it's the mystics get at it, and that's what unites us. And I would say that those who thought about this a lot, and I've done some thinking about it myself, kind of think that is a bias that comes from this need to go beyond religious spirituality, that it's unconsciously affected by these larger cultural currents which brought about perennialism in the first place, right? It's a noble idea to try to find the core of all religions, highly attractive. And I think there probably is a core of all religions in there somewhere, but we can't just sort of look to the mystics to determine what that is, I would argue. So, surface and deep, sure, but there's ways in which what we're talking about, I don't think it fits entirely neatly into that structural division.
Thank you, Steve, so much for this fantastic presentation. Thank you all for showing up and participating. We'll see you next month.
Thanks, Roger.
Nigel.
Everybody.
Thanks,
Great to
Steve.
see you.
Thanks, Steve.
Think well.